All right, good morning, everyone. My name is Chris Bostwick. I'm the Deputy Director of Airside Operations for the Tucson Airport Authority. We're going to go ahead and get started with our first session this morning. Before we do that, we'll just like to thank our sponsors for the first session. That's Avport, Arconis, and Aviation Management Consulting Group, so thank you for that. As we get into it, so just some housekeeping things before we get into the first session. Obviously, this is the main ballroom here. Most of the sessions this week are going to be in here. Some in the afternoon will be in the room next to us, so we'll be doing two sessions at once later in the afternoon. Also, where all the exhibitors are, if you make a right-hand turn, go around the hallway, there's the restrooms. If you go to the back left corner, there's also restrooms there. So if you have any questions, find anyone that's got an ambassador on their tag, we'll be able to help you guys out. And just so you're aware, the Tucson Airport Authority has set up an event command for this conference to kind of support anything that may happen out of the ordinary. Anyone gets sick or has illness, we can help you guys out there. Also, if we have any adverse weather, which we're watching, let us know. We can't, unfortunately, fix anyone's AC, so sorry about that. It's definitely a little warm in here. So we're going to go ahead and jump into our first session, and Todd's the moderator, so thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Nice to see you. Got a great panel this morning. From your left, we'll start with Tori Richardson, the Executive Vice President and COO of the Columbus Regional Airport Authority, and for my purposes, a more important title than that, Chair, AAAE, because he's the only one who can definitely get me fired. Bennett could potentially get me fired, but Tori can do it just if I look at him wrong. So I know you'll all agree with me that he looks especially handsome today in his blazer. And then next to him, Jim Bennett, former chair of AAAE and current director of aviation services for the City of Phoenix Aviation Department. Long and storied career running major organizations domestically and internationally, and we're very pleased that he's here with us. Corrine Nystrom, who runs Falcon Field here in Mesa, Arizona. Yeah, there you go. Excellent. It's clear she's salted the field with, there's some easy questions coming her way, I can tell that. So anyway, thank you for being with us. And then Paul Amon from American Airlines, who handles air traffic Oh, look at that. That is the most applause you're going to get at an airport meeting. That's great. Air traffic management and deals with the both Phoenix, Los Angeles, world airports, and western regions. So thank you all very much. Just so you have a sense of timing and format, we started late, we're going to end early. It's perfect. So we'll end just before noon, and there'll be an opportunity for some questions from the audience. Looking around the audience, there's several people that I am not going to let ask questions, so you can try, but no way. I'm talking to you, Barkey. So anyway, there'll be an opportunity for some questions, but we're going to start. I'm just going to ask you to go down the line for the first one, kind of a quick hit. 2019, how is the year shaping up at your facility or with your company? What's the year looking like? Tori, we'll start with you.
So far we've had.
Yep.
So far we've had a good year. This one works. Here we go. We're on now. Thank you.
There you go.
So far we've had a good year. 2019 has been a great year. It's been a strong year. Both our cargo and our passenger traffic is up. We've got a lot of development opportunities that we've been able to take advantage of. I will say that in the last quarter, though, last 3 months or so, we've seen a little bit of a softening. So on the cargo side, that's usually a leading indicator for us. Hopefully that's not telling us anything, and that we still have a good peak season coming up and round out the fourth quarter. But certainly if things continue to soften, there'll be some warning flags and buzzers going off. But so far it's been a great year for us.
Mr. Bennett, what say you?
I say the same thing that Tori just said. It's a record-setting year. We had a record-setting year last year, and we're on a record-setting mode again this year. We are starting to see some softness in passenger as well as cargo activity. I think in our case, a lot of that softness, though, when we dissect where it's going on, a lot of the softness is our two major hub carriers, American and Southwest. And in the case of Southwest, it is a MAX issue. They're really struggling as an airline, trying to deal with the MAX grounding. And to a certain extent, not as detailed, but Americans got some similar pressures on their system dealing with the MAX.
And we'll talk a little bit throughout the hour on that. Karine?
Well, Falcon Field has been having a booming year, and I think most of the general aviation airports in the Phoenix area are having really good years as well. We've finally recovered from the recession. We're looking at, again, doing over 300,000 operations again this year. Flight training is huge, in part thanks to American Airlines training there now. In terms of our land, we just recently leased out 23 acres of vacant land that a developer is planning to spend over $40 million to construct a variety of different types of hangars, mostly catering to aviation businesses. That's what we're seeing a big interest in. So I think that it's been a great year, and we're hoping the latter part of the year will be just as prosperous.
And obviously, with American Airlines, we have a slightly different perspective, but last week we just reported our second quarter net profit of about $880 million minus or after some one-time expenses. So from a viewpoint of the airlines, we still feel very good about the economy, the future, the amount of travel. We are generally still adding flights where we feel that there is a demand. I know in Phoenix, we just, over the last few months, have added service to New Orleans. We just announced recently going to Cincinnati, Fargo, North Dakota, Colorado Springs. Some of that is seasonal, and but that indicates that we still feel there are some markets out there that we can tap that would help continue what we think has been a great trend over the last few years in sustainability. Our CEO, Doug Parker, has said that we've learned a little bit of the discipline that comes from... Sorry,
My bad.
Okay, well, good. I'm glad it wasn't me. But anyway, that we feel like we can sustain this. You know, the airline industry has always been very cyclical, and you obviously see that as well, too. But I think we found that it's not going to be quite as dramatic as what we're expecting going forward because of just the nature of the industry now and where we are.
All right, so we heard from everybody. 2019 is up. If you hit the rewind button maybe a year or so ago, there was a lot of predictions that 2019 might see a recession. As we got further into the year, people kind of said, nah, it's not going to, but maybe 2020. So then my question for you is, you've hinted, a couple of you have hinted at softness or potential softness. Talk about 2019 and what you think is coming and how you're preparing for it if you think that there's a downturn, as Paul talks about the cyclical nature of the business.
Yeah, I think for us, you know, when we entered 2019, we entered pretty strong and had a really optimistic view on where things were going to go for us. And so we were not, while we were, you know, sort of thinking, well, this slowdown could come and, you know, what would we do if it did? We were really planning for a banner year, another record-breaking year on the passenger and the cargo, and we've seen that. The things that have given us kind of an early indication of maybe 2020, we might see something different again is for us on cargo. So we own and operate 3 different airports, a general aviation airport, one that is dedicated to cargo and military, and then our traditional commercial passenger airport. And on the cargo side, it's all international. We do have the integrators, FedEx and UPS there, but the majority of that is international. And that's a good reflection of how we're doing on international trade, the tariffs, and all the other things that are happening at the global marketplace that are giving us an indication of people aren't shipping as much by airplane, which means they're starting to move to, you know, other modes of transportation with ships and rail and trucks. And so those are a little bit concerning because that means there's an indication in the forecast for those businesses that things are slowing down a little bit. They don't need the product as fast. They don't need as much of it. They're looking for alternative ways to get it there. And so those are the kind of the early warning indicators that we're focused on right now. Everybody still says, when we meet with our businesses, they're still, projecting a strong fourth quarter peak season. But what we've seen in terms of the slowing of our growth in the last, like I said, 3 months or so, has been a little bit of a cautionary tale for us, and we could see something in 2020 not quite as robust that we're seeing right now in 19.
Fed Chairman Bennett, what do you think?
The recession is coming. The question is just going to be how deep and how long is it going to be, and how do we deal with that? It's somewhat of a conundrum in the airport business as to how you deal with the down cycles, because as we all know, as you're making infrastructure investments, they take a long time to deliver, and so for instance, we've got three major projects underway right now. From the time you get the green light to start on those projects until the time you can deliver them into revenue service is about 6 years on these major infrastructure investments. So, as we sit here today, you start a new investment, you have to look a little beyond the little cyclical dips that you're going to get and plan for what's it going to look like on the other side, and make sure that those investments can be done incrementally and that you don't overextend. So you kind of plan for this, and then you really kind of finance and build to this, so that you have a little bit of a buffer in there for these cycles that are going to come through. As Tori indicated, I think with the current global political environment that has surfaced over the past 12 to 18 months, the international market is really starting to suffer as a result, because some of the fastest growing markets that we have, which are Southeast Asia and just Asia generally, these are the fastest growing markets out there. They are being redirected and kind of turned off of traveling to the U.S., and that makes those international flights out of those markets quite challenging, and especially in terms of adding additional frequencies or new services. You're even starting to see some carriers, I think American has even dropped a couple of routes because of just overcapacity, I think out of Chicago into parts of China and those kind of things, just too much capacity in those markets for the current environment, and it's not going to get any better until those global political issues are resolved.
Well, I would say that I would agree with what both of them said previously, that I think we're moving into 2020 cautiously optimistic. Arizona was one of the last states in the last recession to really get hit, but when we got hit, we really got hit, and it took us longer to get out of that than some of the other parts of the country. And so as we're working with this developer that is going to be putting in this huge hangar complex, one of the things that we're trying to do is help them expedite that and help them find the tenants that they're going to need to have in there in order to get through this next recession. And that's where I think, from whether you're a general aviation airport or a commercial service airport, diversity is critical. And some airports are able to have diversity more than other airports. What I have found is if you diversify the types of businesses and the types of customers that you have at your airport, as one area is going up and the other area of your companies and organizations are going down, hopefully the ones that are still holding it together can get you through that recession. So from our perspective, we are an airport that really does diversify. We have businesses that have a number of Department of Defense contracts. We have businesses that are focusing on law enforcement. And then, of course, the recreational traffic is pretty much tapering off. And so the key for us is to continue to be an airport that diversifies, that is not relying on one particular aspect of aviation and general aviation to survive. So that's what we're looking at.
Going into the 2019 season, I think American Airlines was fairly confident that we were going to see a really good year for our bottom line, if you want to go that way, but also from an operational perspective. We were finishing up our merger with U.S. Airways. Most of the labor groups had signed a long-term contract. We were getting all that separate, two airlines behind us and one good synergy to go forward. Some of the things that always kind of throw a hitch into that is maybe a particularly nasty spring and summer weather season that can cause a lot of operational disruptions. But airlines, generally, their two largest costs are fuel and personnel, whether it be training, the retirements, the medical plans, et cetera. The fuel cost is something that sometimes you just don't, we try to predict. We do not normally get into the hedging business anymore. In fact, American benefited from that a few years ago when we didn't hedge and the prices dropped. And I think that was a very boom time for American Airlines, but most of the airlines in general. So there are some factors that, as well as we try to predict and plan, you just, especially Mother Nature, sometimes just don't make that work the way we're hoping. But yet somehow we're still doing pretty well with profits, as I just talked about earlier. Going into 2020, and I'm going to use an example, going back to what Jim was talking about with future investments, and I'm going to use Los Angeles International Airport as a good example, where that, for various reasons, the airport didn't invest, I would say, for an airport that size, an extraordinary amount of money for years in the development of whether it be remodeling, adding gates, remodeling the terminals. It was running pretty well. It was a good airport. It had a lot of benefits going for it, from especially the kind of revenue passenger. That's a big market. Los Angeles to New York is pretty much the top market. In fact, 9 of the 10 biggest markets from a revenue standpoint touch New York. The only one that doesn't is San Francisco to LA. And when I say New York, it's either LaGuardia, JFK, or Newark. But in particular, Los Angeles, and for that matter, San Francisco to New York, are very profitable routes, and that was sustaining that airport. Well, now when the time came that the airlines really wanted to grow, and we really wanted to take advantage of the capacity enhancements at Los Angeles, the airport wasn't ready to accept that at that moment because they hadn't invested in more gates. There's other political and environmental and economic issues that get involved in that, so I'm not pointing fingers. I'm just saying that sometimes if you make that investment, even when the economy is maybe not at its best, it will pay dividends when the time comes we're ready to take it. And now they are, with airlines supporting that, with some of our, I think American did $1.3 billion investment to remodel our terminals. Delta has done something very similar. And it's going to become a beautiful airport in time for the Olympics. And there's some good lessons to learn, both from what they didn't do for a number of years. I've got to say this story, and then I won't continue. I remember I worked for TWA. I'd fly into Terminal 3 at LAX 30 years ago. And then when I started with American, and I flew on a U.S. Airways flight that still came into Terminal 3, 30 years later, it looked exactly the same. The only difference was the red was Virgin America instead of TWA. Otherwise, I couldn't tell difference. I thought I'd just gone back in time. Now it's a great airport. It's going to have a lot of enhancements. It's going to be a gem for the United States for the Olympics and the Super Bowl and so forth. And the money that's going to be invested will pay dividends for them. And so, it's something that we have to always keep on the radar, regardless of the cycle and the natures. Obviously, for American, the fuel prices, our passenger forecast, international is a big part of that, and we're keeping our eyes on what countries have. Obviously, there was a point in time where the South American markets were not doing very well, and we cut back there and maybe enhanced more of our Asian, European markets. And we still find Europe pretty good. We've added service to Bologna and Dubrovnik and Berlin. And so we're still growing in places where we think there is the demand that would support that.
Well, Paul talked about how American has figured out how to smooth out some of the cyclical nature, or hopefully has figured out how to smooth out some of the cyclical nature of the business, but history would tell us that it is still very cyclical. And as Jim Bennett says, a recession's coming. It's just when and for how long. So with that as a backdrop, next question is biggest threat on the horizon that you see at your facility, or in Paul's case with the company. Biggest threat. We don't have to keep going in the same order, so whoever wants to jump in.
Well, I think that in and of itself is a huge threat to us. Like Jim, I mean, we're trying to time development of, just the capital assets, infrastructure, new cargo buildings and things like that to come online so that they are productive and occupied when needed and not overbuilt. So a big threat to us is the stuff and the decisions that we're making today. Are we doing so with that in mind and right-sizing those so that they can be scalable? Maybe we're not doing a full build on something, but we're doing, partial build and provisioning so that we can expand later if the economy stays solid and if that, demand is needed. And so we've been trying to kind of recession-proof ourselves as much as we can with the decision-making, but really the timing and the lack of funding will be big threats for us.
Mr. Bennett, biggest threat?
Well, once again, as Tori has indicated, kind of on the global aspect, I think the economic conditions, when and if they decide to slow down and change, that's probably the larger global challenge that we have. But then to drill down kind of locally to, it's really somewhat related to what Paul was talking about with respect to LAX. At Sky Harbor, we have a relatively small campus, and so every gate that we have is full, and airlines would like to add, and it's always a game of, well, where can we put it? So much so that we will start busing and hard-standing operations. By this time next year, we'll be in the hard-standing business. Because we don't have the gates, and we just received approval for essentially our investment plan for the next 20 years that shows us how we can very quickly try to incrementally get some additional gate capacity at the facility because we're out of gates. But when you have a small campus, like I said, just drill it down to the Phoenix example. When you have a small campus, it's like owning an old house. If you want the new kitchen in the old house, you got to gut it and you got to rip something out and move it to make way for that new kitchen. And that just takes a lot of time and a lot of planning to make that happen. So it's a very complicated puzzle trying to bring these long-term infrastructure projects to fruition.
So I'm going to expand my horizons a little bit just beyond Falcon Field and just talk a little bit about airports in general. And I see one of the biggest threats that we could be facing is the owners or sponsors of the airport deciding that maybe their facility is no longer needed or is less of a priority than it was in the past. And as a result of that, they make some land use decisions that are not compatible with the airport by putting residential properties in close proximity to their airports. And then those residential folks, over time, exerting enough of their opinions to sway those who are making decisions about the future of the airport. So ongoing land use issues are big. On an even bigger scale, I think the pilot shortage is a huge deal. And it's going to be catching up. It's already catching up. And of course, I can't speak for the airlines, but I do know at Falcon we have a very large flight training school. It's an international flight training school. And for years, what they have done is they have only worked with international airlines. And in some cases, like with China, they work with the government directly. And their training model is that they take young students right out of the chute. They've never had any experience at all flying an airplane, and they train them at Falcon. They train them from the ground up so that when they return to their country, they can then get trained in the particular type of aircraft that they're going to be flying, and off they go. So the traditional pattern of, you know, you go get your private pilot's license, and then you get your commercial rating, and then maybe you become a flight instructor for a while until you can get on with a regional carrier. You're on with the regional carrier until the big boys pick you up. That model is not being followed in other parts of the world, especially in Asia and in Europe. And what we have seen recently is I think you're starting to see a shift with the domestic carriers. JetBlue was the first one to come to this flight school at Falcon, and they are now training their students from the ground up. They're using the Asian model and the European model, and this company, CAE Oxford Aviation, also now has a contract with American Airlines pilots, future pilots, that have no prior experience ever flying an airplane, and they are training them from the ground up. So the model is having to be changed because of the fact that you've got this huge pilot shortage. So how that's going to ultimately play out remains to be seen, but we're seeing firsthand that model, a different model, is now being used.
To go back to your original question, our biggest threats are what I mentioned before: American Airlines, the fuel prices, and our personnel costs. American Airlines has made a major commitment to take care of our employees. That can't be emphasized enough. And so we want to preserve all the benefits and all the rights for our employees any way we can, but it's still a high cost to do that, and we're committed to that. And obviously we have to pay the fuel prices, whatever they are. Speaking about the pilot shortage, I used to be a professor at Embry-Riddle back in 2007, 2008 for a few years up in Prescott, Arizona, and we saw firsthand when the economy was not doing well after 9/11. There was obviously the recession, and for pilots, students who want to be pilots, I should say, they can see that at some point in the future, it's a rewarding career, good money once you get to that spot. But the process there can be very tedious. You don't start out the day after you get your private pilot's license flying a 747 to Hong Kong, obviously. So in that process of flying maybe light twins, working your way up, if there's not that goal of eventually working your way to the top of the industry, and that's really no different than a lot of other industries, then they're going to look for something else, and the enrollments in Embry-Riddle drop dramatically, the income that school had, and that's a secondary effect of what we've been talking about. So certainly the supply and demand of the quality employees that we need, not just in the cockpit but in other places. If an airline or the industry is contracting a little bit and people say, all right, there's not a future, and they move somewhere else, then it's not just a matter of the count of the people, but also the quality of the people that you get that we would like to have to provide the best service possible.
Let me switch gears for a minute. Jim Bennett talked about this, the 737 MAX issue, and you can all take a crack at it, or, certainly I'm going to ask Paul to talk about it. You have Southwest that is most impacted.
Right.
American, which is next in line, and then to a lesser extent, United.
Right.
So, Paul,
And
since you,
Ryanair, I think it was.
Well,
who was the?
yeah.
Was it Ryanair that
Yeah.
had a huge order?
yeah.
Over in
So I
Europe
was
as
thinking
well.
domestic, but yes, they did.
Well-
So, Paul, let me ask you to,
Sure.
to the extent you can. Now, I get that you're not in the airplane scheduling part of the shop, but
Right.
Clearly, this isn't the first time anyone's asked you about it.
No, I get that question quite a bit, actually. But yes, it has had an impact. I've really seen it this summer. Our load factors are as high as they've been in 10, 15 years. American Airlines has only terminated one city pair because of the MAX, and that was DFW to Oakland. What we've done instead is maybe instead of a city pair having 8 flights a day, we go to 6, or maybe instead of 2 smaller airplanes, we put 1 bigger airplane, and that frees up crews and so forth. And we've actually had a problem with our 737 crews, because we've got all these spare crews sitting in a place like Miami where most of the MAXs were, and now we don't have as many 737s down there for them to fly, so we start having to try to send them out, which takes time, and that's part of their duty day. It's part of their, we have to pay them to go to LA because we don't want to send them in and train them, and then as soon as they get done with training, the 737 MAX is recertified, it's back in business, and now they're not qualified anymore. So that creates challenges for us as well, too. As far as the actual certification, American Airlines still has a lot of confidence that that airplane will be certified within a reasonable amount of time. I don't think anybody's going to say it's going to be exactly this date. Obviously, we thought that maybe at some point by early September that plane would be recertified, or at least authorized by the FAA, and that hasn't happened. So there's a little bit of uncertainty. But at the same time, that airplane has a lot of great advantages. It's a much quieter airplane, so if you have concerns about noise at your airport, as we keep bringing in these new airplanes like the MAX, like the NEO, the A321 NEO, and they're much quieter than the MD-80s, the older 737s, the older Airbus airplanes. So there's a lot of advantages in addition to just lower fuel costs, lower operating costs. And we don't want to lose those advantages. And it actually can bring higher number of passengers to your airport from, instead of maybe a 145-seat airplane, now we've got 155, 10 more passengers who may be going through that airport and buying concessions or whatever you have. I don't want to get into the political side of the MAX too much. I will say that as I talked about the personnel costs and the training costs, I think Boeing has tried to keep the 737 as similar as they legally can, so that it remains the same type rating. We don't have excessive training. We don't want to sacrifice safety. I don't think anybody wants to sacrifice safety, but you're trying to find that happy medium, and it sounds like maybe they missed the mark a little bit on that, and now they're having to go back and fix that. So our biggest challenge, and I'll end with this, is once that airplane is back, the biggest challenge will be getting the people to feel comfortable flying in that airplane again. Passengers, as you know, have a lot of different attitudes about airplanes and what you see in the media, and maybe starting off, there'll be a lot of customers who probably don't want to fly in that airplane, but I think in time, when they see that the problems have been corrected, they'll get back to it. But it's also our pilots. We have to make sure our pilots are comfortable flying that airplane. That's a big challenge, too.
Doug Parker said he'll be on the first flight.
Exactly, he did, to Lester Holt, I believe. Right.
Yeah. Okay.
And, Paul's absolutely right, but, from an airport perspective, you may have gone from 8 frequencies a day in a market to 6 frequencies a day, but from the airport impact, that's less seats in your market, so that's less people going through your facilities. The load factors right now are just off the charts. We're seeing extremely high load factors, and but the seats are coming down because frequencies are down, and routes are being impacted by the ongoing delay of getting the MAX back in the air. The more impacted airlines like Southwest, initially they were able to pull a lot of rabbits out of their hat with, maintenance on existing 737s and stretching out cycle times and all of that, but the rabbits are gone now out of the hat. And as a result, they're really having to get more aggressive on their seats and, their frequencies, because they got to maintain these older airplanes that they're still flying around. And I don't know how many of you saw the article this morning. Paul mentioned Ryanair, but O'Leary was quoted in the article this morning, and he just flat out told Boeing that they needed to get their, it starts with an S, together. And, Ryanair is a huge 737 operator, and they have a massive MAX order. And I think he was putting them on notice that that may come to a screeching halt if they don't get their stuff together.
So from a medium hub airport perspective, like Jim said, we're seeing the same thing. I mean, we're taking it day by day. When we first got the announcement, we looked at the schedule, and it was minimal impact. Like you said, they were able to absorb some of that early on, and it really kind of eased the pain. As they got further into it, though, then we started to see routes that used to have a MAX on it, now getting a traditional 7.3 put on it, and then they're trying to figure out, well, what market is that going to come from? And so now you're really playing competitive airport to airport, which one's most profitable, who's going to keep that 7.3, or maybe the MAX route that's gone away for a while is going to get your 737, and you're going to lose that. We've seen that. We're down probably 10 flights a week right now, all on Southwest. There was no impact on the American side for us in Columbus, but Southwest, it's been about 10 flights a week. And we know that most of those passengers have been able to get into some of those available seats on the other carriers, but with 85 to 95% load factors, we also know about 20% of those cancellations because of the flights gone. We know we're not picking up those passengers. They're gone. The other carriers, American, Delta, and United, have actually picked up their market share, basically capitalizing on what Southwest has left on the table as a result of that. But we still know 20% of the market for Southwest is not there right now. Those passengers are just either not going or finding some other airport somewhere else to make the trip.
Go ahead.
And I was just going to say, and then just one more side note, kind of what Tori was talking about on the market shares. The other interesting thing that is happening is that some of these ultra low-cost carriers that drive the majors crazy, Spirit and Frontier, to name a couple, they're seeing unique opportunities here to go in and kind of grab market as these aircraft are out, because they don't own any 737s. They're flying all Airbus products, and they're getting new equipment all the time. So now they're looking at traditional routes flown by some of these majors and that are struggling with the 737 problems and saying, oh, opportunity. So that really is kind of mixing things up a little bit too.
I would just add that from a perspective, and this is specific to Falcon Field, we've got a huge Boeing facility that has a through-the-fence agreement with us. They actually manufacture the Apache helicopter there at Falcon Field, as well as a number of unmanned, super secret types of drones. But when we first heard about the MAX, Boeing had already shared with us that they were planning on doing a major expansion there at Falcon Field. And our initial reaction was, what effect is the MAX going to have on their expansion plans? Because people think, well, Boeing's a big company and they're going to, they're big enough to survive, and they will. But what effect does that have on some of their future expansion plans with some of their other products that they offer, unless they've got really solid contracts with either Department of Defense or some of the foreign ally countries that we work with.
Good point. All right. This is a warning. We're going to go to audience questions after I ask one more question. So that's a warning for whoever's got the mic to be ready. And it's also a warning for all of you to think about what it is that you might want to ask these folks. I come from Washington, D.C. I live there. I don't want to admit that I come from there, but I live there, that area. And we've clearly got Congress right where we want them, palm of our hands, because we're getting everything that we want in the legislative and the regulatory arena. It's great. So my question for the panel is, if you could wave the proverbial magic wand and get Congress to do your bidding and get something accomplished that you've been trying to get for a while, that's a big top priority, what would it be?
Okay, I'll bite. Well, it's probably two things that I think we all deal with, and all of us here in the airport community, and we probably are not going to be necessarily aligned with our airline partners. But if you look at the airport improvement program for the past 20 years, roughly, the government has been consistently allocating $3.3, $3.4 billion in AIP funding for grants. And we get all excited about that every year. But if you adjust that 3.3 or 3.4 for inflation, it only buys about $1.4 billion worth of infrastructure investment at today's prices. So in a sense, every year, we've been getting less AIP entitlement money, or less AIP money allocated for airport projects in this country, as they just keep allocating the same amount, and it just doesn't buy what it used to buy. And the same thing applies to the airline's favorite fee, the passenger facility charge. A $4.50 passenger facility charge is worth about $2.26 today in the market. Are airport projects still being done? Yes, they're still being done, but we're paying for them differently. We're bringing on a lot more debt than we necessarily need to be bringing on just to get these infrastructure investments put in place. So those are my two fixes: fix the PFC and fix the AIP at the same time.
Can I, before Ori says anything, can I just ask a question? Because I personally thought that was brilliant. But do materials cost more or less today than they did 20 years ago?
It's a couple of dollars more expensive.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So wait a minute. So it's higher material costs, but lower buying power?
Yeah, pretty much.
Well, that
And
blows.
just to make that even worse, for all of us that are doing major investments, and I don't know of any large and medium hub airport that doesn't have major infrastructure investments underway, it's higher cost. But then it's also a challenge of even finding trades and labor to build your projects. Because the downturn that we had in 2008, a lot of people got out of the construction business and they didn't come back in. So there's a real shortage of certain trades in the industry. So it can get challenging these days.
I would agree wholeheartedly. It would be an infrastructure package that includes a reform that optimizes AIP and PFC. And for us, we're looking at a roughly $2 billion midfield program for basically redeveloping, the Columbus Airport and the terminal building and parking garages and entranceway and all that stuff. Well, it's going to cost us an additional $1.8 billion to finance that if we're not able to have an increase in PFCs and just having to amortize that out and finance that over a period of time. So basically a $2 billion project's going to cost us close to $6 billion. Had we been able to invest that or collect for that, it would have been easier on all of us. So I know Paul mentioned, Los Angeles and others who maybe have not been able to invest. That's pretty much all of us. And in some cases, the airlines have been able to partner and put some of their, investment into that airport, but they can't do it to all of them. If you look at the financials from the airline or the airport side, there's not enough money to do all the investments that are needed, especially when we've been booming the way we have and been growing. Our passenger traffic has been up 20% over the last couple of years, and so we're going to run out of capacity in our existing facility before we're able to build anything, and clearly before we'd be able to have a finance package in place to do the building.
Corinne, you don't need a PFC at Falcon Field, so what do you want?
Well, actually, I'm very supportive of increasing the PFC because the goal would be to have Congress raise that, and then the money would then be available through the grants to go to the general aviation airports, because a $150,000 cap on your entitlements at a GA airport, I can't even hardly do a design project. I mean, it would have to be a really small project. And for the smaller airports that, don't have the availability of a lot of discretionary funding, they're going to fall by the wayside if they can't get that funding. So I'm very much in favor of the PFCs being increased, because I think they'll help the industry all the way around.
Paul, here's your chance for early retirement.
Yes. Well,
To go out in a blaze of glory, to be held up on the arms of airport directors all across the region. Tell me that you too support an increase in the PFC.
they make a good point, and I'll tell you why. The customer experience starts at the curb, not at when they get on the airplane. And so I'm all, if it's me personally, I'm all in favor of collaborating, working together to find that happy, that perfect spot that provides the right customer service and experience from the moment they drive onto the airport property all the way through till their flight is over, they pick up their bags, and they leave at the destination. And that is important. And I'm all in favor of whatever we do as an industry, and I'm talking not just the airlines, but the airports, and to some extent the funding for the infrastructure of our national airspace system as well, to improve that experience. And I don't think the airlines would disagree with that. Where we find that perfect point, obviously there is a little bit of a difference, and fortunately I'm not on the government affairs side, and I have to tackle that every day. I'm more concerned about what we can do to improve that experience for the customer. And I'm sure they'll work it out. I'm sure that at some point we'll get to where the airports feel like they can have the money to provide that experience that we hope the passengers will get, as well as improving the national airspace system. So the one little thing I will add that's different is I would also like to see, if I had that magic wand, they have the, for example, some of the next-gen technology, the next-gen advisory group, start setting some a little bit more firmer mandates and not just continue to kick that can down the road. There are some great technologies out there that are going to reduce greenhouse emissions. There's going to be ways that we can digitally communicate between aircraft that will improve capacity in the airspace. That technology's been, airplanes have been able to land themselves for years. We already have drones. We know what the technology is that's out there. We just need to move faster to standardize the improvements and not let various factors drag the feet on that.
Well, editorial comment by Hopley. That's one of the best airline answers to the PFC question I've heard in a long time. It'll probably get you surveilled or put on secret probation. So if anybody's having a conversation with Parker, don't tell him how reasonable Paul was in his answer on that. Okay, let's take a couple of questions from the audience. Oh, here, I can handle this one.
Thank you. Jennifer Maples with Phoenix Sky Harbor. Corinne, you mentioned the pilot shortage, but I'd like to ask the question a little bit more broadly in terms of, that's trickling down into other parts of the industry. So what challenges have your organizations been having in hiring and retaining talent And what unique initiatives are you potentially considering to help improve your talent pool?
Okay. American Airlines obviously being a large airline with international travel, and generally one of those airlines that people, pilots, ultimately as that's where I want to work. We maybe don't have quite the same problem as smaller carriers or general aviation or maybe even business jets, because we're kind of at the top of the spear when it comes to pay and benefits for pilots, and just maybe the glory of Catch Me If You Can. I can't even think of the name of the actor, but you know what I'm talking about. That whole glamour side of the airline industry. We can always rob our regional partners for their talent. In fact, we do. We have a lot of flow-through programs. So we don't see it so directly. It's more, like you said, kind of, and what I kind of refer to, when the pilots, the student pilots that are just starting out the careers don't see that logical path in a reasonable amount of time, then that's where we may start to see some issues going forward, because it used to be far worse than it is now. So maybe it would help if regional carriers would enhance the pay for their pilots, and not just the flight deck, but also other critical key safety of flight positions with the airline, certainly, and business jets. In some cases, maybe better working conditions, better. The federal government's gotten pretty good with the pilot duty limitations, so that we're not exhausting guys by flying way too many hours. There's still, I think, some improvement there, so that it's not years and years of just struggling to make ends meet before you finally have the flight hours to get there. I think some of the training can focus more on cockpit resource and management and safety, so that if they don't have 5,000 hours, of the 3,000 hours that a pilot might have, that 3,000 hours is more quality training and more quality experience than just being in a cockpit. Heck, half my hours in the Air Force were just spinning in a circle. I'm not sure I was gaining a lot of experience just flying the same heading for 5 hours out and back. Yeah, I got a lot of hours, but I'm not sure that equates to a more learning environment where you're flying in difficult conditions in mountainous terrain with a lot of weather. That's what really makes the pilots more confident in their ability, and we need to pay them accordingly.
So I'm going to go off of the pilot shortage part of it for a minute, because obviously as an airport, we don't train pilots, we don't train flight crews. But in the years that I've been in this business, which is a lot more than I sometimes like to admit, I've seen a real transition in terms of the type of individuals that are going into the airport management industry. You know, if you look back, the model right after World War II, they had bunches of, pilots, B-17 pilots or whatever, who came out of the military and they transitioned into managing an airport. Well, first of all, the military over the years has not been training as many pilots. And secondly, you have people who are legitimately interested in the airport management side of things. And yet, when you ask a little kid at an open house, what do you want to do in aviation? They always say, I want to be a pilot. And then I ask them, have you ever thought about becoming an airport manager? And they look at you like, what are you talking about? So I think it's important that we take the people who maybe have not gone through the pilot path to eventually become airport people, that we take those people and we work on succession plans, because people like myself and a few of you out there in the audience, we're not going to be around forever as much as we would like to be. And it's important that we get really serious about succession planning and make sure that we bring along the new people who are genuinely interested in managing an airport to help them become familiar with it, be good at what they're doing, and be able to take over the reins when the rest of us fly off into the sunset.
So yeah, if I could broaden just beyond the pilot piece a little bit as well, I'll touch on that first though. In the state, we're actually working to find a way that the state in Ohio would be able to work with communities, their universities and colleges, and even state education programs to find ways to do loans either on construction of facilities or on programs to actually get pilot training, aircraft maintenance, as well as FAA maintenance and controllers, and see if we can help boost the pipeline, for those types of workers. On the airport side of it, it boils down to training programs, attraction and retention programs. We do find it hard to get certain types of employees in our organization. The days of a traditional mechanic coming in where it was just turn the wrench on a very, simple piece of equipment has gotten a whole lot more complex. You heard our keynote speaker talking about sophistication. That has brought in a whole lot of complication and complexity. So, maintenance folks now coming into organization, they need to know how to do high-tech diagnostics and work with computers, the $1.3 million aircraft rescue firefighting equipment or multifunction snow removal equipment for those of us that have snow that's more than, just being able to look at it, that you actually got to move it and do something with it. Those pieces of equipment are very complex pieces of equipment that take a different skilled labor and even tools to work on them. So we're trying to work on that as well. It's all training, retention, and attraction.
It's great to be in the last one to speak on the topic because everybody's pretty well said everything that needs to be said. But a couple of things that are missed on the airport side, I think, is one of the challenges that you have in an airport is sometimes can be your governance structure. We don't necessarily operate our airport businesses as a business, which is if anybody kind of knows my management style, we run a business. And it needs to be operated as a business. And so your talent pool and succession planning in any corporate America or any business in the world is critical to the success of that business. Unfortunately, our governance structures don't necessarily embrace and facilitate that kind of approach to running a very complicated business. If you're municipally owned, you don't set your HR policies. They're set by the municipality. And, kind of to Tori's point, so the electrician that's working for the streets department, I can be the airport electrician. What are these things called runway lights? I can do that. I can deal with that. Or, what is this? I'm a mechanic. Yeah, sure, I can work on I work on pickup truck. I'm sure I can tackle that ARF thing. So it makes it extremely difficult to really put together a good quality succession plan if your governance structure doesn't really facilitate that. And then, the last thing is that when I hire people, I always like to try to find somebody that wants my job, because that's what you should be looking for, is somebody that wants your job. And that kind of drive and commitment to the business. And sometimes that's hard to find because a lot of times people think they want your job, but then they don't necessarily want your job once they find out what your job is. So, that's one of the challenges that we all have.
All right. Is the burning, quick burning, anybody? Okay. We satisfied the public open, requirement. We had one audience question, so congratulations to us on that. I'm just going to sum up by saying I thought, editorial comment by Hopley, I thought that was an excellent panel. Moderator kind of sucked, but the panel people were really quite good today. Obviously, Tori was far and away the best. I think we can all agree on that. But we can also, I think, agree that, for an airline person, Paul was actually pretty darn great. So And Corinne, thank you very much for, I thought you made a great point about the PFC, because it is, the large hub airports would give up that last part of their entitlement money. That would flow back to the smaller airports and the general aviation airports. It sort of is that covenant that the airport community came up with in 1990 when we put the bill together for the first time, something for the larger airports and something for the smaller and general aviation airports, so that everybody had a vested interest in pushing for that. So that's a great point. Fed Chairman Bennett always makes great points, and I hope you're right that we're off into the future a little bit further on the recession. Thank you all very, very much for participating. Thank you all very much, and we are going to turn you loose. So thank you.